I'm thrilled to talk a little bit about the exhibition that this talk is pertaining to, and that is Women, Surrealism, and Abstraction. And it's an exhibition that's composed of works of art from the extensive Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art collection. And we do permanent collection exhibitions that last a year, often on one floor of the museum building. And we have rotating floor exhibitions on the other floor. And this year we chose to do women, surrealism, and abstraction, largely to acknowledge that this is the year of the woman, 2020. And in doing that, and curating the show, I noticed that there's been quite a bit of influence, both in terms of surrealism and abstraction, on many of the artists that the museum collects. And the collection focuses on Western American art from the 19th and from the 20th and 21st century. And there are many works of surrealism by women and abstraction pieces that emphasize abstraction in the collection that haven't been seen before and haven't been seen in a group before like this, of all females. And this was a great opportunity to bring that work together. Also to kind of take a look beyond the usual art historical boundaries that were usually define surrealism and abstraction, and take a look at artists that were practicing in other media, ceramic, fabric, and photography, printmaking, etc. And look at that all side by side. I wanted to acknowledge the support of the Utah Division of Arts and Museums for making the exhibition possible. And I want to introduce Phillip Brown, who is the marketing guru for the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art. And on staff there, he came up with a brilliant idea for this exhibition, and that was to ask poets to respond to artworks in the exhibition. And Phillip himself is a poet, so I could see why he would bring his sensitivity to the table to do that. But it's been extraordinarily wonderful to have this juxtaposition. So I'm going to turn this over to Phillip, who will talk about the format with our panelists, our conversationalists tonight. So Phillip?
Yeah, thank you, Bolton. So I, as Bolton mentioned, have a background in poetry. I work at the museum and in the PR and marketing role. And as we were putting together this exhibition focused on women's voices in art, it seemed like a real natural fit for me to include women's voices in literature and kind of create this conversation between the two. And so I reached out to some of our poetry contacts in the community and was referred a list of many different women poets, and sent out an invitation to participate in this exhibition. We had a great response. Many people wanted to participate. And the way I went about it is that I knew we would need the poems in advance of the exhibition in order to prepare them and have them on the walls along with the wall labels. So I sent all of the poets digital images of all the artworks. And they were able to just go through and look at, see which ones they were interested in, and then choose one to write a poem about. And I asked people to do a sign up. So we would just have one poem per artwork. We ended up with, out of an exhibition with I think about 40 artworks, 16 of them have poems. And it's really lovely to see them on the walls. It was fascinating to see who responded to what, who wanted to write about which pieces, and then of course, what their inspiration was and what poems resulted. I think that it's a really fascinating experience to view the artwork, especially with abstraction and surrealism, which opens itself to some looser interpretations, or maybe there's looser associations. And I think it's really fascinating to read a poem and have those two in dialogue with each other. That's why I'm really excited about this evening's event, because we're literally bringing them in dialogue with each other, the artists and the poets. And so I think it's definitely something that you should check out. If you are seeing the exhibition in person, you can read the poems, like I mentioned, next to the artwork. But we've also recorded a selection of the poems as a poetry audio tour, and that can be found on our website on that exhibition page that I was sharing earlier. So that's also wonderful, because you get to hear recordings of the poems and also see the artwork side by side. So this evening, we want to sort of recreate a little bit of that experience. So we have 2 pairings this evening, and we're gonna go through each set, see the artwork, hear the poem. We'll do the first one with Jacci Den Hartog and the artist and her work, and then Britt Allen's poem inspired by the work. And then we'll move on to the next pairing, which I'll introduce after that. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring up an image, a side by side of the work and the poem. Before we actually read the poem, I'd like to have our artist and our poet introduce themselves. So Jacci, let's start with you, and then we'll move over to Britt.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody who I can't see out there, but thank you for coming. So my name is Jacci Den Hartog, and I live in Los Angeles. I'm thrilled to be in this exhibition. I'm so happy to have a piece of, to have this sculpture, Fracking 2, in the collection of the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum. So thank you very much to the museum. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. It's really nice to be here tonight. So yeah, I live in Los Angeles. I've lived here for the past 30+ years. But I spent most of my childhood, a lot of my childhood and most of my teenage years in Utah. So it's really nice to sort of be back in Utah again. And I do, you know, have to acknowledge that I think my growing up years in Utah, and also in between, we moved back and forth a lot across the country, but I always go back. My work is really, I draw a lot from my memories of what it was like growing up in Utah. And I think that has been a really big impact on my work. The way I think about the sort of body in relationship to the landscape was really informed by growing up surrounded by mountains and moving through space. So I'm really interested in my work in the relationship of our bodies to space, how we experience our bodies in relationship to the earth. And I really consider my work sort of coming out of both the earthworks land art sort of tradition in a really removed from, you know, from the landscape into an object sort of manner. But I also consider my work coming out of both the earthworks and the landscape traditions. So, and my work is both sculptural and two-dimensional. So that's a brief introduction to the work and my influences, I guess. So thank you.
And I will jump in. I'm Britt Allen. I'm also very grateful to have been included in this exhibit. I've been able to attend in person, being located in Logan myself. And it's a really incredible, really powerful collection. When and when thinking about what I write and why I write, I was thinking about a quote by Louise Gluck, and she just won the Nobel Prize this year. And she wrote, "The actual making of art is revenge on circumstance. The risk," she goes on, "is in the possibility of shame. Writing poetry then becomes an act of courage, purchased with sacrifice or loss. In poetry then, the speaker of my poems, who often stands in for me, takes revenge on the circumstances of her life by being blunt, bare, and brave on the page." Marie Howe, in her book of poems, What the Living Do, often poses the question, how can a woman love a man? And it's certainly one that my speaker slams against over and over again, in light of childhood violations, in light of abuse. Is there a saving grace in marriage? Is a healthy relationship possible between a man and a woman? And how do you tell in today's culture? And speaking of, our Year of the Woman, our culture today is still very much a hostile place for the female survivor. As of November 2018, an estimated 88.2% of rapes in Utah alone go unreported, which makes the known statistics much lower than the truth. The rape rate in Utah has been consistently higher than the national average over time, increasing by 10.7% between 2014 and 2017. Having been born, raised, and raped in Utah, my speaker is aware of the context surrounding her individual traumas and strives to give voice to her experiences at such a pertinent time. And when I say my speaker, I also, say myself. I struggle with speaking after growing up under a silencing abuser, ergo I write. With the present studded with hashtags like Me Too and Why I Didn't Report, followed by waves of confessions of victimhood behind the screen of social media, the time to talk about sexual abuse is now. The U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, on their 2017 Sexual Violent Fact Sheet, claimed women with a history of sexual assault are more likely to attempt or commit suicide than other women. In many ways, my speaker writes as a means of self-examination and manic deflection against dying of the truth. By examining the way violence is made erotic in female confessional and post-confessional poetry, which is what I study, my speaker confronts and reflects upon her experiences navigating a culture, childhood, and patriarchy where sex determines worth.
Thank you, Britt, and Jacci for the introductions. I think we're going to just go ahead and have Britt read her poem, and you can see the poem here alongside Jacci's work and already start to maybe see things that seem parallel to you or things that stand out. And then we'll move on to our next pairing.
Jude. There is nothing quiet about a womb blown with seed, straight man's wetland boned beyond relief, the cunt crash remnants fossilized after a life of high-pressure semen calcification, lockjawed snarling. The ovaries have slit their leashes and overdosed their darlings. A woman's holiness hollowed out by a lifetime of smiling. Mother's lips have turned to teeth, a bear trap where honey used to be.
Thank you, Britt. So I want to move on to our next pairing. And I'd like to have introduce themselves Eva Kwong, the artist, and then we'll get to Mary Ellen Greenwood, the poet.
Hi, I'm Eva Kwong. I was born in Hong Kong and I moved to New York as a teenager. And so I realized I'm not going to ever become a poet. So I went into the arts. I thought visual arts is a universal language. And it's funny, I just had this intuitive feeling that that's what I wanted to do with no particular rhyme or reason at that time. So I applied and went to a high school music and art, and then I went on to Rhode Island School of Design, and then on to Tyler School of Art in my grad school. And so I've been an artist my whole life. Much of my work has been inspired by forms from nature and also the human figure, and in particular the female figure, because that's what I inhabit. And also the cells and microbes that are inside and outside of us, and the concept of the one and many and the many of one. And I guess because I grew up in many cultures, I've traveled in many countries, that I realized that we are all unique individuals, but at the same time, we share a commonality as human beings. We all share the same thing. We all have the same dreams, and we all have the same things that we, same loves and etc. And also the concept of fertility and mortality. Maybe Philip, can you do slide 1? The two threads of fertility and mortality has been kind of running throughout my work since the early 80s. So the navel, slide 2, please. So the navel is a remnant that reminds me of my mother and my grandmother, who are important people in my life. And it connects us also to other people who are not present with us anymore. So in the 80s, in the early 80s, where these slides are from, they reference the female belly, the pregnant belly. But in the most recent piece, the navel of the universe, I made an opening so you can see through and either look through or speak through into the space, or imagine that you could do that. You can imagine you can travel into that little space within. That small opening blocks out the rest of the world. So when you're focused in it, you're just focused into that little bit of light at the end. It allows us to enter into a different dimension, a different kind of space, maybe a psychic space or a spiritual space, and communicate or speak to either yourself or to someone who is not with you. Thank you. Marianne.
Hi, I am Mary Ellen Greenwood. I am a native Utahn. I am a lecturer at Utah State University. I work in the English department. And I'm also working on a PhD in education. I decided a couple of years ago that I needed a little extra stress in my life. But what I found is that this collaboration is one of the highlights of 2020, and we need as many highlights as we can get this year. The other one was I eloped in May with my husband. So these are like my top 2. And I love working with students. I love working with writing. And I find that my poetry is inspired by experience. And my muses these days tend to be my 2 children. I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. So lots of moments of inspiration, both positive and negative, but it keeps me going. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to just share now this next image. We'll go full screen again. And here we are with the sculpture and Mary Ellen's poem, which I'll invite you to go ahead and read.
Thank you. Navel of the universe. Lucky egg that would be you, split in 2. Cells divide. Inside where blood-filled cord, 2 feet of pulsing line, pumping life to grow in you. Days and weeks and months, emerging, air filling wet lungs, sterile blade slicing cord. End of day, you lift your sun-glow arms just high enough, red shirt rises, soft skin peaks, reveals the round depression, midsection scar, where a lifeline, invisible, connects us still.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. So I think this is just a taste, a reminder that there's a lot of more of these pairings as part of the exhibition, but I'm glad that we get to kind of delve into these 2 right now. We have a few questions that I think relate to these pairings. And so for starters, I'd just like to ask the poets about why you chose the piece that you did. You were given a long list. You had a lot of options. I know both of you chose more than one, which was kind of great to have multiple poems. But in this case, what made you gravitate towards these particular artworks? And then what did that inspire? Like, how is your poem connected to the piece? We can start with maybe Britt, and then we'll talk to Mary Ellen.
Perfect. Yes. I don't know. Is it possible to pull the slide back up with the picture, just so I can sound a little less crazy as I describe my thought process? When I saw Jacci's sculpture fracking too, I don't know. To me, I saw a womb, right? As the first slide or the first line of my poem implies, there's nothing quiet about a womb blown with seed. I saw a uterus and the arms, the fallopian tubes, right? And I think part of it is that it was hollow and it was pink, but also the fact that it was destroyed and obliterated, and I saw this piece and it moved me even absolutely more in real life, because it was, down at the bottom, it says, 34 by 42 by 17 inches, but like, I don't think in numbers, right? So I had no idea how big this sculpture actually was. And it's even more mind-blowing in real life. You think of fracking and not that I think that childbirth is a direct equivalent to like fracking a woman's body. But historically, it sort of has been, right? It's only very, very, recently that in this country, women have had the right to vote, right? And own property. And there are still so many things. There's still an incredible wage gap. There's still not perfect equality in the world, or in this country, or in this state. And that's typically what I write about too, is I write a lot about gendered violence. I'm interested in speaking the truth of my experience, the truth of being a woman in this body, in this place, in this time, as I have lived it. And I saw a parallel in this sculpture, and I think about how many generations of women who could have been poets, who could have been directors, who could have been activists, who could have been leaders, who were swallowed up instead in motherhood, the way it was historically imposed upon women and expected. Not to mention like the women dying in childbirth. There's just so many women we have lost, and so that's why I wanted to write about this piece.
That's great. I'm actually thinking I'm going to pause while we have this up, because I'm curious to hear the artist's perspective on the poem. So maybe we'll talk with Jacci and then we'll do same thing. We'll kind of go to the next pairing. So I'm curious, Jacci, what the experience was like to read a poem about one of your sculptures, and if that poem has influenced or shifted at all how you see your own work or this particular piece.
Yeah. Wow. Britt, thank you. I'm sort of overwhelmed because first of all, I'm overwhelmed to know that my work can elicit that kind of a response from somebody, and I'm grateful that a sculpture that I made can have that personal connection. And, so I'm sort of overwhelmed and blown away and very grateful, that my work can elicit, that sort of, really personal and also, I think, universal, sort of experience that Britt has just spoken so eloquently about. Thank you, Britt. And I, when I first read Britt's poem, I was sort of like, oh my God, I was a little bit blown away. I was like, oh, wow, but it touched me, so deeply. And you know, so my experience of first reading it was like really, you know, one of sort of like being a little bit, you know, overwhelmed because, you know, it, for me, I was, you know, really thinking about fracking. I mean, I really, and, but I think that, you know, the relationship between the human body and the organic world is so interrelated because we all are of the same matter, you know, and so when I'm making my work, I am thinking about empathy with the organic world. And so when I was building fracking, I mean, when I'm conceiving of a sculpture, or especially a work like this, which is so abstract, it really, first of all, you know, for me, comes out of, you know, research. And but when I was in the midst of a body of work, and this piece, I had just read these statistics about the number of fracking wells in Los Angeles, and, you know, somewhere like in the range of 200 fracking wells in Los Angeles. And I was just so kind of overwhelmed with that statistic. And so I made a piece that I was resonating on that statistic and on that idea when I made Fracking 1, which is a piece that, a corollary to this piece, but came right before this piece. And I think that, you know, when I'm making the work, I'm being pretty objective about my relationship to the form I'm going to make. I'm thinking about, you know, I'm really trying to, like for example, like with this piece, when I read that statistic about the number of fracking wells in Los Angeles, and believe me, I don't sort of like remove myself from the idea that, you know, I drive a car, I use gasoline in my car, and so I in no way am interested in absolving myself from any kind of environmental, you know, superior, well, I don't want to, you know, come off as like I'm some sort of environmentalist superior to anybody else, because I drive a car, I engage in all the same activities. But one of the, you know, but I can't even imagine the idea of thinking about fracking, like whoever came up with that idea. You know, it's like, I think when I read Britt's poem, I was thinking about like, wow, if we didn't think about the earth as associating it with female and with, you know, the earth as sort of a feminine source, but we thought of it as male. I was thinking, gosh, would the idea of fracking have ever even been invented, you know? And so, you know, I don't know, I went off on this whole other sort of train of thought after I read Britt's poem, but, you know, I think that, you know, so I don't know, when I'm doing the research for the work, because even though this is an abstract piece, it comes out of like research because I have to know where I'm going. And so I was reading about what fracking entails and different kinds of fracking technology. And so the form that it takes was very much based on this idea of Poisson's effect, which is, you know, a geologic formation compressed, and, you know, it expands in two directions according to the force coming down. In order to sort of like build a form, I'm thinking about these sort of ideas associated with fracking and trying to sort of get at what happens underground when, you know, when this kind of force pressure is put there. So yeah, but, you know, I think that all bodies respond to force in a similar kind of way, whether it's the body of the earth, you know, or the body of a human being, that forceful actions perpetrated in an unwilling kind of way have repercussions that sort of transcend the body that it's on and include all bodies. So yeah, I was you know, just really happy. No, I can't say happy, but I was, what's the right term? I don't know, you know, just grateful that my work could have different responses, you know, that are so strong and powerful, and you know, help give a variety of views about bodies and their relationship to violent action.
Great, thank you. So yeah, let's ask some of those same questions over to our other pairing, starting with you, Mary Ellen. I know you wrote a few poems for different pieces, but what drew you to this particular one, The Navel of the Universe, and how did that inspire your poem?
Could we pull up that slide as well? Is that
Yes,
all right?
we can. Let me
Thank
get
you.
to that.
Or could you do it? I'm not doing it. The
Yes,
royal we, apparently. I don't know.
While I'm doing that, why don't you go ahead and
Okay,
talk
I
a
will
little
start. I was immediately drawn to this piece. I saw images of all of the pieces. And finally, I was able to this week to take my children and see it in person at the museum. Because Britt said I needed to do this because you were hit with joy. That was the phrase you used. And I thought, I need to be hit with joy this week. So, and I was. But it's such a beautiful piece. And I saw a generational connection when I saw this. And I realized the influence that one generation has on another. And I started to think about my love for words. And I know that started with my own mother. She read to me. And she tells this story that I had forgotten because I was too young at the time. But she made a case to my elementary school principal when I was in kindergarten that I should be allowed to check out library books. Because at the time, kindergartners were not allowed to do that. This was back in the day. Things have changed. But she was an advocate for words. And I thought about that influence that it's had on me. And I think about the kind of influence I have on my own children, and that generationally, there are chains, there are links that happen both physically as a baby is growing, but then emotionally throughout life. And so I wanted to write about that.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And Ava, I'm curious as well, again, like, what was it like to read a poem that was about one of your sculptures? And has that influenced the way you see this piece?
Well, it was quite wonderful. It's as if she read my mind. When I read it, the first time I read it, I said, I can't believe this. As if she knew all the words, except that, of course, in my mind, it's all jumbled up. That's why I'm not a poet. But, you know, it's I've been kind of thinking about, and reading that poem also brought me to think about, okay, where did this come from? You know, because sometimes when I'm working in the studio, I am usually just working intuitively. I just start working until something happens, and I continue to build on it. Or if something does not work out, I redo it. I've redid this piece a couple of times. It is, you know, then I remember that it actually goes back to the 1980. And in the 80s, I did a lot of pieces that dealt with the body. And also I was thinking about fertility. I was thinking about mortality. I was thinking about having children, and I was thinking about my daughter, and later on my son. A shout out to my daughter who's on right now. And so she inspired a lot of this. But then in the last 5-10 years, I've lost a lot of my family. I lost my grandmother, who was the most important person in my whole entire life, and then my mother, and then of course other people, my partner, Kirk Mangus. And I realized that I am still connected to them, you know, and it made me think about the navel. The navel is like a scar that reminds us that we was once the there's a remnant of the umbilical cord that was once the linkage to my mother, and also through my mother to my grandmother, because she was the most important person in my life growing up, and also to other people that I've lost in my life. So I made an opening through the piece, through the sculpture. The other sculptures I did in the 80s were all solid. You know, you cannot see through it. But this one you can see through. And there were some things that I didn't realize. Well, it comes from reading about many cultures where people go to speak into a hole in a tree or a hole in the ground or in a cave to talk to someone that's no longer with them. So, so that's kind of the impetus of that opening. And what I didn't realize until after I finished making it, and until I was actually showing it, is that when you look through it, or when you're nearby, it blocks out the rest of the world. You get sucked into that little hole, that little space, and you kind of leave the average world behind, and you enter into a different, maybe a psychic space or maybe a spiritual space, but into an opening that maybe our own mind that allows us to either connect to our own inner self or connect to somebody else, you know, or be able to speak to someone that we no longer see. Like I talk to my grandmother every day.
Great, thank you so much. That was a fascinating sort of back and forth. I know Bolton has maybe some questions to ask, and I just wanted to remind everyone that you can also, those who are viewing can ask questions, type them in through the chat or as a comment on Facebook, and we'll be able to give those questions to our panelists.
Yeah, you know, this exercise has been so interesting because we have, you know, the poems are up like a label next to the artwork, and I wondered, you know, for the artists, it must be really interesting to hear a different kind of voice, because the voice that you usually hear on the labels or see on the labels is a curatorial museum institutional voice, and it has a certain tone and a certain style, and then the other kind of commentary you might get in your work is through an art critic, at least in terms of something written. So I wondered, for the artist, what's it like to hear a voice from a poet as opposed to these two other entities that I just mentioned?
Well, I think it's so wonderful because it goes down much deeper. You know, it's on a much deeper, for me, it's a much deeper level, you know. And when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, she really got the piece. So it's not about kind of more or surface, you know, like the date, the time, you know, or where it's made, what it's made from, you know, we usually have. But that kind of deals with the work on a much deeper level.
Yeah, and you know, it brings a voice to the work that is, you know, it brings another artwork to an artwork. You know, it brings a different kind of art form to an art form. So I'm, you know, in a review, in a, you know, a didactic statement, it's about that work in a pretty objective way. You know, I think a reviewer or a critic tries to, you know, get at the work from as objective a way as possible, you know. And so I think it's interesting to have a different kind of voice that is not about trying to be objective. It's coming from a different, you know, from another artist. It's so it's two art forms coming up together, which I think is so, you know, it's really great. It's wow, it's really amazing because I mean, a good review or even a bad review sort of really helps, you know, can be clarifying. It can be, you know, exciting. It can be, you know, interesting. It can be devastating. But having a different artist respond with another artwork, it's very exciting. You know, it just brings, it's different. It's just really different. So, yeah, I think it's nice to hear a voice that is not your own voice in relationship to your work, and to see what kind of, and to know, you know, I think it also is great to know that the work can have an impact, you know, on a viewer who's not there to sort of write, you know, about the work from, you know, from a critical point of view, but from a really different point of view. So it's very exciting. It's really great.
Philip, do we have any other questions? Do we have questions from the audience at this point?
We did just get a question from somebody in the audience. Ava, your piece is stunning, and the poem that accompanied it is also wonderful. I love especially your idea that the chord and that opening transcends time by including life and death. Would you elaborate on your process of how this piece was edited? You said it changed, and I'd love to hear about that. Congratulations to everyone. Beautiful ekphrastasy at work. Anyway, so Ava, question about how the work changed.
Work changed. I guess I was referring to, I don't know, Philip, if you can bring up like the second image from earlier. The work in the 80s was mostly my own body and looking within myself. And the sensations and the feelings and inhabiting my own body. But with this one, I think with the Navel of the Universe, and I didn't make this shape for quite a long time, you know, like these pieces, which all dealt with basically me, I guess, you know. So in particular, like this, the one on the right is called Linea Nigra, which is the black line that happens when you become pregnant. It just shows up one day, and then of course after the baby's born it disappears. I remember the first time I noticed it, did Kirk draw a line on my belly while I took a nap? Then I realized it's not his style of drawing. He does not draw like that, you know. So, then it was like, what the hell is it then? What is it then? So all these kind of dealt with experiences that I for myself. But I guess the impetus for the Navel of the Universe, I guess it was like a decade in between where I wasn't working on shapes like these. But I started it after my mother's death. And I was thinking, you know, I was missing a lot of people in my family. In a few years' time, I lost Kirk, I lost my mother-in-law, lost my mother, and I lost a lot of friends as well. And I was thinking about my connection to them and what are some ways that I can still connect to them. So the opening became a way to do that. I think of it like a conduit or a way to link myself to them, or for anyone to link into other people. Over the last couple of decades, I've had several pieces of sculpture, of installations that dealt with mortality. One is the Gold Silver Room, and one is Lament. Lament was also shown at Logan last year, which is a wall with teardrops. And I realized that, you know, no matter who we are, whether we're young or old, we all, no matter what language we speak, no matter whether we're tall or short, we all experience this sense of loss. That's kind of part of being a human. Our sense of our own mortality and also our sense of their mortality. And so the opening allows us a space to deal with that, or to cope with that, or to communicate, or to speak to that. Lament oftentimes, which is a wall of teardrops, and in some iterations, I've also had a wall of Chinese funerary paper that the audience is invited to write on, and I hang them up with temporary adhesive so that they can take it down and put it back up. So I've done it at several places, and it's quite interesting because I felt like there's so many things that I want to express to the people that are no longer here. There's so many, and I'm sure other people have the same concerns, or the same interest in doing that. And so I remember, I think it was the mid-90s, first time I shown it. And it was at Kenyon College, and I don't know how many pieces of paper I had up, but probably close to 100 or maybe more. And I wasn't sure, and initially I wasn't sure if anybody would respond, And but when I came to pick up the show, every single piece of paper was filled, and it was very poignant and in some cases very heartbreaking what people wrote on there. So that was also kind of always been sort of back of my mind, in that we all have this interest or need or in some time in our life to or desire to connect with somebody who is no longer present with us. So that's kind of what led to the opening.
I had a question for everybody, and I think we've sort of through in terms of the context of the show, it's about surrealism and abstraction. So I wonder how you might think about that in regards to your work. I'm especially curious about the writers, and whether or not the traditions of surrealism and abstraction enter in or factor somehow in your work, or how they might manifest themselves.
I'll stab at that. It's interesting. I was just thinking earlier today, I took a folklore class during my undergraduate degree. And as part of that class, I took on like a project, a final project that eventually got put into the archives up at USU as well. But I chose to do a study. I collected sex jokes. That was my folklore project, is I collected sex jokes from my peers. And when I asked however many friends, right? And there was a difference even in the way my girlfriends and my dude friends told sex jokes, right? When women told me sex jokes, even if everyone had to Google sex jokes and then pick out their favorite ones to tell me, like, there was even a difference in the ones women picked out as opposed to men, right? The ones that my girlfriends picked out were veiled, right? They were based in puns, they were based in innuendos, they were indirect, right? And my guy friends, conversely went for explicit, right? And I just think it's so interesting the way that we're taught and not taught to talk about sex, and that I really do think there is a big gender difference there. And so when I write, it is writing. I almost push against surrealism in a way. I remember when I was working on my thesis in poetry, my thesis chair, which is the poet laureate, Shannon Ballum, encouraged me to do more surrealist work, because damn, I'm just on the nose sometimes, in this really blunt way. But I do think in my core, it's a pushback against silence. I push back in my writing against abstraction and surrealism. And I go for the concrete. I go for the grit. I want, my readers to feel the blood on their hands. That's like really violent imagery. But I don't know. So for me personally, I use words to point and to stab and to accuse and to pick. And so I think in that way, collaborating with art is kind of mind-blowing in a way. You know, I think both poetry and visual art can be I don't know, a way of saying the unsayable. And so as far as surrealism and abstraction goes, I'm supposed to be doing more of it. but I push back. I do the opposite. It's not a moral stance I have. It kind of is. I'm rambling. Mary Ellen, what about you?
You want me to keep? I'm just want you to tell me a few sex jokes later on. My supply is pretty low. I saw this collaboration as two languages. So abstract art is this language of shapes and colors and lines and form. And then poetry is this language of sound and rhythm and alliteration. And so for me, this collaboration was these two languages, these two having a conversation. And it was this really interesting interweaving. And both are so powerful, but together, there was just this elevation that I'd not experienced before. And I walked away from this experience thinking, I see art and I hear words in a different way. And I think it was only possible because of this idea of abstraction and of poetry coming together.
I'll talk about my interest in both abstraction and representation, because I'm currently involved in both ways of working, and I kind of love both ways of working. I work both abstractly and I work both, you know, really as realistically as I can. I've got a series of works that I'm working on simultaneously to these abstract pieces that, you know, the fracking too, I consider very much about abstraction. But for example, the realistic or the representational work that I'm working on are waterfalls, local waterfalls from the local San Gabriel Mountains or the local waterfalls around Southern California. And my interest in making those sculptures is to be as true to the waterfall as I actually can. I consider it a portrait. And I consider, you know, when I go out and and I'm drawing and I'm photographing and I'm thinking about, you know, coming back to the studio and building a form, I really want it to, I'm really trying to be objective. I'm really trying to treat it as another being, as another living entity, and to express what I can in terms of that form. So I'm trying to be really treat it like a portrait. And I talk about that. I think about that work for myself as the thinker part of myself. And then when I move into abstraction, I think of that work as the knower part of myself, where I don't, that's the work where I still have to do a lot of research, but then it becomes much more of a collaboration with my materials. And I think that oftentimes something much different comes out through that process, because when I'm really becoming engaged with process, like I'll give myself some very limited parameters to work within. And then once I have that set, then it's really, there's this sort of such a freeing element about it. So, and in many ways, the thinker work is much easier because it's more, you know, I work from drawings, I work from photographs, I have a plan and a system, and I can do it. But the knower work, it's much more difficult because I go places that I'm not familiar with oftentimes. And so it leads me on a journey, you know, which is really exciting. And so things emerge from the knower that even though that I didn't know yet. So anyway, I've had to think a lot about this because I've had two simultaneous bodies of work going for several years now, and they both feed into each other, but they're, you know, they bring together different parts of myself that I really enjoy working in that regard. So yeah, it's and in the they're both about spaces. They're both about going into space, but one is an exploratory space, like a spelunker going into the earth and not knowing where you're going to end up, and the other is like a you know, setting a course and with a direction and having a map and having something to follow. So yeah, that's how I think of it for myself.
Well, I'll answer this on abstraction too. I find abstraction very useful as a process because it allows me to filter out the unnecessary parts. And to me, I only want to focus on what's essential to this piece, usually what's essential to this particular idea. So I usually just start from there. Sometimes I have the title for the work, and to me also the title is sort of acts as a guide of how I should proceed, what form I should make, how I can go about doing it. So with the name of the universe, it's the opening. For me, that was the most important part. But like, you can't have just an opening without the sides, you know? So it has to have some sides to kind of hold it in so you can see the opening. So I had to build the sides first, you know, and I have to figure out technically how to make that work and not pull itself together, you know, not pull itself apart, you know. So it was sort of like tricky engineering just to make that little hole.
Great, thank you for all of those comments. I think it's really fascinating to hear, you know, 4 different interpretations or how, you know, 4 different ways of working and how this affects you. We probably need to be wrapping up here in just a second, but there was one interesting question that I was curious, maybe if there's a short answer of, from someone on Facebook was asking if what you are doing these days is in any way connected to what we see as part of this pairing. So I wonder if maybe that's a question about, has this pairing led to maybe some new work, or are you thinking about your work in terms of something that came from this pairing? And I imagine that could be for any of you.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes things usually takes a while for me to kind of percolate. And usually it comes out sometime, somewhere, you know, usually unplanned, generally speaking. Generally, you know, it bursts out sometime, and then I go, know, oh yeah, that's where it comes from. You know, it's sort of like the naval piece too. You know, in the 90s, I was thinking about some pieces that also dealt with, actually, you know, I made a sculpture called Whisper to the Beloved, Your Beloved, Whisper to the Sky, Whisper to the Beloved. And it was a gramophone that you speak into, made out of metal, but it has holes in it. So it's sort of, the sound dissipates. It does not does not enlarge the sound, you know, it actually dissipates, but you point it into the sky to speak to somebody you want to speak to. So it sort of, you know, goes back to that a little bit. And I'm interested to see what will come out, you know, probably won't come out till next year because I'm currently involved with a different project, you know. So I sort of want to finish this first, but sometimes I don't know. Sometimes I go in the studio and I just start something totally different and it takes me in a different direction. So
Yeah,
hard to,
that makes...
it will, I'm sure it will, because, you know, every experience usually you know, every experience that enters into my life usually enters into the work somehow, sooner or later. Thank you very much. And thank you, Bolton, and thank you, Phillip.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For me, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'll jump in. Phillip, you're a rock star. You have the hard job here. I really appreciate you. Moderating is tough. For me, it certainly encouraged more collaborative work with the visual arts. It's interesting because my partner is an artist. He's a painter and a sculptor, you know, and I've wanted to engage his work, like with his work as a poet for a long time. But it's interesting because I'm running up against, I'm having a hard time separating my husband from the artwork when I sit down to write about it. You know, I see what my husband's done, and I see the man I know and the marriage we have, you know, inside of all of his artworks. And so it's interesting because I'm like, wow, like, how do I separate that? And, you know, conversely, when I worked with Fracking too, you know, I didn't know anything about Jacci. I didn't even know her inspirations. I just saw the sculpture and went for it. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do that with other works of art, and hopefully, you know, build a body of work with my partner. I'm super excited to do that.
That sounds really like a great project. I'm excited to potentially see that in the future. Any final thoughts? I do want to wrap up, but I just wanted to see if there was any last comment that someone wanted to put in.
Have any more questions from our audience?
What was that, Ava?
Do you have any more questions from our audience?
I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we're good. Well, yeah.
Thank you everybody for participating, our artists and our poets. It's been an unusual experience for me, and I think a really valuable one. And hopefully we can include exercises like this more in the future. I think it's incredibly fruitful. So I wanted to just tell everybody that we're having another Zoom film premiere of the Beloved Community Project next Wednesday. And it's going to go from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And Katie Lee Coven, the Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art, and co-moderator Amy McDonald will introduce the film and talk about it, and along with the founder and director of, well, Amy is the founder and director of Brawley Arts for, and they're going to be having a conversation about civil rights, racism, and community through the voices of Black Utahns, artists, and those fighting for social justice. So we hope you come back next Wednesday evening for that Zoom as well. So thank you to the audience for listening to us this evening. And Phillip, thank you for coming up for this with this idea. It was really so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it worked out. And thank you everyone for your comments. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I know we could just keep talking forever about art and poetry and back and forth, and but we'll bring it to a close. And everyone have a good evening, and look for our next Zoom event next Wednesday. Thanks everyone.